The night after we buried my daughter, my son-in-law stood in the doorway of the house she grew up in and told me something I will never forget. Not quietly, not gently, just cold. You have 60 days to move out. 60 days. After I had just buried my child, but what he didn't know was that the house he was standing in was never his to give away, and when I left that night, I took something with me that would change his life forever. My name is Arthur, and on this channel, The Untold Story Files, I share stories that most people never hear, stories about injustice, betrayal, and the moments when the truth finally comes to light. Some of these stories are about quiet acts of cruelty, others are about people who thought they could take everything until the truth caught up with them. Today's story is about grief, family, and a man who believed he had power over the wrong person, and how one quiet decision made in the middle of the night changed everything. Before we begin, a quick note. The stories shared on this channel are dramatized accounts inspired by real experiences and situations. Names, locations, and identifying details may be changed to protect privacy. These stories are told to reflect on human behavior, difficult choices, and the consequences that often follow them. If you're watching, I'd also love to know where you're joining from tonight. Leave a comment below and tell me your city or country. Now let's begin. A grieving mother forced out of the only home that still held her daughter's memories. A son-in-law who thought the house belonged to him. A secret buried inside old paperwork no one bothered to read. And the moment he realized, it made the biggest mistake of his life. The rain started just before the funeral ended. Not a storm, just a steady gray drizzle that made everything feel heavier. The cemetery outside Cedar Ridge looked like a painting someone had forgotten to finish. Muted colors, wet grass, black umbrellas. Margaret Ellis stood beside the fresh grave of her daughter Emily and felt as though the world had quietly stopped moving. 32 years old. That was how long Emily had lived. 32 years of laughter, stubbornness, late-night phone calls, and Sunday dinners. And now there was only a polished stone with her name on it. Margaret barely remembered the drive back from the cemetery. The car moved. People spoke, but none of it seemed real. The house looked exactly the same when she arrived. White siding. The porch Emily had painted herself 10 years ago. Margaret sat in the passenger seat for a long moment before opening the door. Inside that house were 32 years of memories. And now, Emily wasn't in any of them anymore. The living room was full of people when she walked inside. Relatives, neighbors, friends from Emily's workplace. Someone had brought cast, someone else had placed flowers on every surface. Margaret barely noticed any of it. Her eyes kept drifting to the staircase. Emily used to run down those stairs 2 at a time when she was late for school. Margaret could still hear the sound of it in her mind. Footsteps, laughter, life. Now the house was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel Carter stood near the window. Emily's husband. Tall, sharp-featured, the kind of man who always seems slightly impatient with the world. He gave Margaret a brief nod when she entered. No hug. No words. Just that same stiff expression he had worn all day. Margaret had never fully understood Daniel. Emily loved him, that had been enough for Margaret. But there had always been something about him. Something distant. Something calculating. Still, today wasn't the day to think about that. Today was about Emily. The guests began leaving around sunset. One by one, hugs, quiet condolences. Margaret thanked each of them automatically, barely hearing what they said. By 8 o'clock the house was nearly empty. Only Daniel remained. Margaret stood in the kitchen rinsing coffee cups when she heard his footsteps behind her. He leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "Margaret," he said. His tone was flat. "Practical. I think we should talk about the living situation." Margaret frowned slightly. "Not tonight, Daniel." But he didn't move. "We should get it sorted sooner rather than later." Something about the way he said it made her uneasy. "What do you mean?" Daniel exhaled slowly, as if explaining something obvious. "This house is too big for one person." Margaret blinked. "One person?" For a moment she thought she had misunderstood. "This is my home." Daniel's expression didn't change. "Well, technically it was Emily's." The words landed like a stone. Margaret felt the air leave her chest. Emily had bought the house years ago after getting promoted at work, but Margaret had lived there long before that. Since Emily was a child, it had always been their home. Daniel pushed off the doorway and walked into the kitchen. "I'm planning to sell it." Margaret stared at him. "Sell it?" "Yes." His voice remained calm, detached. "I'll give you 60 days to make arrangements." The words echoed in the quiet kitchen. 60 days. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter. "My daughter was buried today." Daniel shrugged slightly. "I understand it's difficult." Difficult. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. "Daniel," she said slowly, "this house has been my home for 30 years, and now it's my property." He checked his phone as if the conversation was already over. 60 days is generous. Margaret stood there long after he left the room. The house suddenly felt different. Smaller, colder, not home, just walls, and somewhere deep inside her mind, a memory stirred. Something Emily had said months ago. Something about paperwork. Something about just in case. Margaret dried her hand slowly, then she walked upstairs. Not to pack, not yet, but to find something Emily had left behind. Something Daniel clearly didn't know about. And before the night was over, Margaret would make a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't wait 60 days. She wouldn't argue. She wouldn't beg. Instead, she would leave that very night. And when the truth finally came out, Daniel Carter would wish he had never opened his mouth. Margaret Ellis didn't cry that night. Not when the last car pulled away from the driveway. Not when the house went quiet. Not even when the clock on the kitchen wall ticked past 9. Instead, she sat at the dining table staring at the envelope in front of her. It had been tucked inside the back of Emily's desk drawer upstairs. Margaret had found it almost by accident. Inside were 3 things: a copy of a property deed, a letter, and a small key taped to the corner of the page. Margaret hadn't read the letter yet. Her hands were still shaking. Downstairs, she heard Daniel moving around the living room, cabinets opening, the refrigerator door, the casual sounds of someone who had already moved on. Margaret stared at the deed again. She had only read the first 2 lines before she stopped breathing. Property owner Margaret Louise Ellis, not Emily, not Daniel, Margaret. For a long moment she thought it had to be a mistake. Emily had bought the house 8 years ago. Margaret remembered the day clearly. Emily had been proud, excited. She had insisted on paying the mortgage herself. Margaret had protested at first, but Emily was stubborn, just like her father had been. And Margaret had eventually agreed, because that's what mothers do. They let their children grow. But now this document said something completely different. Margaret turned the page slowly. Her name was printed clearly, and beneath it Emily's signature, dated 6 months ago. The letter sat beside the document. Margaret finally picked it up. Emily's handwriting was unmistakable, neat, careful. Margaret unfolded the paper and began reading. "Mom, if you're reading this, it probably means something has happened to me, and if that's true, I'm sorry. I wish I had said these things out loud. But I didn't want to worry you. Daniel has been different for a long time. I didn't tell you everything because I thought I could fix it, but I also wanted to make sure you were safe. That's why I changed the house ownership 6 months ago. It's yours now, legally and completely. Daniel doesn't know. And I didn't want him to know unless he gave you a reason to. If everything works out, you'll never need this letter. But if it doesn't, then you deserve to know the truth. And Mom, you deserve to stay in your home. Love always." Emily. Margaret lowered the letter slowly. The room felt silent in a different way now. Not empty, heavy. Emily had known. Somehow Emily had known. Margaret wiped her eyes for the first time that night. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Downstairs, Daniel laughed quietly at something on television. Margaret looked around Emily's bedroom. The bed was still unmade from the morning. Clothes folded neatly on a chair. A framed photo of the 2 of them sat on the dresser. Emily at 16. Margaret beside her, both smiling. Margaret picked up the photo and held it against her chest. Then she stood. If Daniel had given her 60 days, he expected 60 days of arguments, tears, begging, but Margaret had lived long enough to understand something important. Sometimes the strongest move is silence, and sometimes the best revenge is patience. Margaret walked to the closet and pulled out a small suitcase. She packed quietly. Just essentials, clothes, documents, Emily's letter, the deed, nothing else. The house itself would remain exactly as it was. Every chair, every picture, every memory. Daniel thought he had won. Margaret intended to let him believe that. By 10 o'clock her suitcase was by the front door. Daniel noticed immediately. He muted the television. "You're leaving already?" Margaret nodded calmly. "You said 60 days. "Yes, well," she said quietly, "I won't need that long." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That was faster than I expected." Margaret picked up the suitcase. She didn't argue. She didn't mention the letter. She didn't mention the deed. Instead, she simply said, "I hope the house sells quickly for you." Daniel smirked slightly. "I'm sure it will." Margaret walked past him toward the door. Her hand paused briefly on the frame. 30 years of memories. Birthday parties. School mornings. Late-night talks with Emily. She allowed herself one final glance at the staircase. Then she opened the door. Rain had stopped. The night air was cool and quiet. Margaret stepped outside, and without another word, she left. Inside the house, Daniel Carter leaned back on the couch, satisfied. He had expected a fight, but instead, the situation had resolved itself. Easier than he thought. He grabbed his phone and opened his messages. There was already a text from a real estate agent he knew. Still interested in listing the property? Daniel typed back immediately. Yes, let's move fast. He looked around the living room. Soon the house would be sold. The money would clear his debts, and Margaret Ellis would be someone else's problem. Daniel leaned back and smiled. What he didn't know was that he had just scheduled a meeting that would expose everything. Because in less than 3 weeks, a real estate office across town would open a file, and the very first line on the property record would make the agent stop cold. The owner of the house was not Daniel Carter. It wasn't Emily Carter either. It was a woman who had quietly walked out the front door that night, Margaret Ellis. 3 weeks after the funeral, Daniel Carter sat inside a modern real estate office on the second floor of a brick building downtown. The place smelled faintly of fresh coffee and printer ink. Glass walls separated the offices. Framed photos of recently sold homes lined the hallway. Daniel sat across from a woman named Laura Green. She was one of the top listing agents in Cedar Ridge. Sharp suit, .com voice, the kind of professional who had handled hundreds of property sales. Daniel liked that. He wanted this process to move quickly. Laura tapped on her keyboard. All right, she said, eyes on the screen. Before we list the property, we always run a routine title verification. Daniel nodded. Of course. He leaned back in the chair, completely relaxed. The house would sell quickly. It was in a good neighborhood, large yard, recently renovated kitchen. Emily had put a lot of money into that place. Now Daniel planned to get that money back. Laura continued typing. Then she stopped. Just for a moment, Daniel barely noticed, but Laura frowned slightly. She clicked something on the screen. Then another tab opened. Her fingers moved faster now. Daniel watched her with mild curiosity. Everything all right? Laura didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to the monitor. Then she said something that made Daniel sit up. That's strange. Daniel's smile faded. What is? Laura turned the monitor slightly toward herself again. Let me double-check something. She opened another document. A scanned county record appeared on the screen. Laura read it carefully. Her expression didn't change. But she stopped typing. The room went quiet. Finally, Daniel said, "What's going on?" Laura turned slowly toward him. "Mr. Carter, are you the legal owner of the property at 214 Maple Ridge?" Daniel frowned. "What kind of question is that?" "Just answer the question." Daniel shifted in his chair. "Well, technically my wife owned it." Laura nodded slowly. "Your late wife, yes, and the property has gone through probate." Daniel shook his head. "No, it didn't need to. We were married." Laura looked back at the screen. Then she said something that made Daniel's stomach tighten. "That's not what the record shows." Daniel leaned forward. "What record?" "The county property registry." She turned the monitor slightly. A legal document filled the screen. Property address, parcel number, ownership record. Daniel scanned the page quickly. Then his eyes froze on the line labeled current owner. He blinked, read it again, then a third time. The name didn't change. Margaret Louise Ellis. That's wrong. Daniel's voice came out sharper than he intended. Laura remained calm. "This document was filed 6 months ago." "That's impossible. It's notarized and recorded with the county." Daniel shook his head. "No, Emily bought that house 8 years ago." Laura clicked another file. "Yes," she said, "and 6 months ago, she transferred ownership to who?" Laura looked directly at him. "You just saw the name." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's my mother-in-law." Laura nodded. "Yes." Daniel laughed suddenly, but there was no humor in it. "That's obviously a mistake." Laura leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Carter, property records don't change by mistake." Daniel stood up. "This is ridiculous." He paced once across the small office, then turned back. "My wife never mentioned anything about transferring the house." Laura folded her hands. "Well, legally speaking, she didn't need to." Daniel stared at her. "You're telling me I can't sell my own house?" Laura corrected him gently. "I'm telling you that according to the legal record," she tapped the screen, "it's not your house." Daniel felt heat rising in his chest. "This doesn't make any sense." Laura nodded slightly. "Then I would suggest speaking with the owner." Daniel scoffed. "She moved out. Where did she go?" Daniel hesitated. He didn't know. Margaret had left quietly that night. No forwarding address, no phone calls, nothing. Laura noticed the pause. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "without authorization from the legal owner, the property cannot be listed for sale." Daniel stared at the screen again. Margaret's name sat there like an accusation. 6 months ago. Emily had changed the ownership 6 months ago. Why? Daniel felt a sudden flicker of unease, but he pushed it away. This had to be temporary. A technical thing, some paperwork error. He grabbed his phone. "I'll call my lawyer." Laura nodded. "That would be wise." Daniel walked toward the door. But before he left, Laura added something else. "Mr. Carter," he turned, "there's one more detail you should know." "What?" Laura turned the screen again. According to the record, the transfer wasn't conditional. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? It means the property was transferred as a full and permanent gift. Daniel felt the floor drop slightly beneath him. Laura continued calmly. In other words, she pointed at the document again. Even if your wife had lived another 50 years, that house would still belong to Margaret Ellis. Daniel left the office 15 minutes later, but he didn't go home. Instead, he sat inside his car in the parking lot. His hands gripped the steering wheel. Margaret Ellis, the quiet woman he had pushed out of the house, the woman he had given 60 days to leave, now legally owned the property he planned to sell. Daniel felt anger rising, but underneath that anger something colder. Why had Emily done that? 6 months ago, right around the same time Emily had started asking strange questions about money, about accounts, about things Daniel had told her not to worry about. Daniel swallowed hard. For the first time since the funeral, a new thought entered his mind. What if Emily had known something, and what if Margaret Ellis knew it too? Across town, in a small apartment above a bakery, Margaret Ellis sat at a kitchen table. The envelope rested beside her tea. She hadn't told anyone about the deed, not the bank, not Daniel, not even Emily's closest friends. She simply waited, because Emily had left her more than a house. She had left her time, and Margaret knew something Daniel didn't. The truth has a way of revealing itself, especially when someone tries too hard to hide it. And soon Daniel Carter would learn exactly what his wife had discovered before she died. Because what Emily found in those final months was far worse than anyone expected. Daniel Carter didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table of the Maple Ridge house long after midnight, staring at the same legal document his lawyer had emailed him. The screen of his laptop glowed against the darkroom. The transfer was real, filed with the county, signed by Emily, notarized, recorded permanent. There was no technical error, no clerical mistake, and according to the lawyer, reversing it would be almost impossible without proving fraud. But fraud by whom? Emily had signed it. Daniel rubbed his temples. 6 months ago. Why had Emily done it 6 months ago? He leaned back in the chair, and slowly, memories began resurfacing. Little moments he hadn't paid attention to at the time. Questions Emily had asked, arguments that had started for no clear reason. The night she had asked about their finances, it had been late. Daniel remembered because he had just come home from work. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table with a laptop open. Not relaxed, not casual, focused, serious. She looked up when he walked in. "Daniel," she said carefully, "can we talk about something?" Daniel had sighed. "What now?" Emily turned the laptop slightly. "Why are there 3 credit accounts I don't recognize?" Daniel barely glanced at the screen. "They're business accounts." Emily frowned. "You told me your company closed 2 years ago." "It did. Then why are the balances increasing?" Daniel's patience thinned. "Emily, you don't understand how business financing works." Emily didn't move. "That's strange," she said quietly. "Because I called the bank today." Daniel felt the memory hit harder now than it had then. Emily had been calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that meant she already knew something. "What did the bank say?" he had asked. Emily looked directly at him. "They said the accounts are in your name." Daniel shrugged. "That's normal." Emily nodded slowly. "But they also said the debt is tied to our shared assets." Daniel remembered the way his stomach had tightened slightly, but he had brushed it off. "Everything's under control." Emily closed the laptop. "Daniel, are we in financial trouble?" Back in the present, Daniel exhaled sharply. That conversation had ended badly. Emily had pressed harder, asked more questions. While it started reviewing documents, Daniel had told her she was overreacting. Eventually the argument ended the same way most of their arguments did. Emily went quiet, and Daniel assumed the issue had passed. But now, the timing suddenly felt different. 6 months ago, right after those questions, right after Emily started looking at the finances, Daniel stared at the email again. The house transfer. 6 months ago, across town, Margaret Ellis was sitting at a small wooden table above the bakery on Pine Street. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh bread. It wasn't large, but it was quiet. And after everything that had happened, quiet felt necessary. Margaret held Emily's letter again. She had read it at least a dozen times. But tonight she noticed something new, a line she had overlooked before. "Daniel has been different for a long time." Margaret whispered the sentence out loud. Different how? Emily hadn't explained. But Margaret had raised her daughter. She knew Emily well enough to understand something important. Emily wasn't the type of person to act out of fear. She acted when she had evidence. Margaret reached into the envelope again. This time she pulled out something she hadn't fully examined yet. the small key taped to the document. It was brass, simple, and attached to it was a tiny tag. Margaret turned it over. 3 letters were written in black marker. SDB. Margaret frowned. Then realization slowly formed. Safety deposit box. The next morning Margaret walked into Cedar Ridge National Bank. The building was quiet. Soft carpet, muted lighting. Behind the front desk sat a middle-aged man with silver hair and a polite smile. "Good morning," he said. "How can I help you?" Margaret placed the small key gently on the counter. "I believe my daughter left something here." The banker looked at the key tag, then at Margaret. "Your daughter's name?" "Emily Carter." The man's expression changed slightly. He turned to his computer, typed something, then paused. After a moment he stood up. "Mrs. Ellis, would you mind coming with me?" They walked down a quiet hallway toward the back of the bank. Heavy steel doors lined the corridor. Safety deposit boxes. Margaret felt her heart beating faster. The banker stopped at a small office before the vault. He opened a folder on the desk. "Mrs. Ellis," he said carefully, "your daughter opened a safety deposit box here 4 months ago." Margaret nodded slowly. "She listed you as the secondary authorized person. Can I access it?" The banker hesitated slightly. Then he said something unexpected. "Yes, but," he added one more sentence. "One moment, please." He left the room briefly. Margaret waited, her hands folded tightly in her lap. 2 minutes passed, then the banker returned, but he wasn't alone. A second man walked in behind him, older, serious, a dark suit. The banker cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ellis, this is Mr. Raymond Hale." Margaret looked at him. "Who is he?" The banker answered quietly. "He's the attorney who helped your daughter prepare the contents of the box." Margaret felt the air shift. Why would my daughter need an attorney for a safety deposit box? Mr. Hale spoke for the first time because, he said calmly, what she left inside may become very important. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Important how? The attorney looked directly at her. "Your daughter believed her husband was hiding something." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "What kind of something?" The attorney opened the folder slowly and said the words that would change everything. "Financial fraud." Because what Emily had uncovered was not just debt, it was something much worse, something that would soon bring police, investigators, and consequences Daniel Carter never imagined. Margaret Ellis sat across from the attorney in the quiet office beside the bank vault. The room felt colder than the hallway outside. On the desk sat a single metal box, small, gray, plain, but the way the banker handled it made it feel heavier than its size. Mr. Raymond Hale folded his hands. "Mrs. Ellis," he said carefully, "your daughter asked me to be present if this box was ever opened by you." Margaret nodded slowly. "And why would she do that?" The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid a document across the desk. It was a letter, but this one wasn't written by Emily. It was typed, legal, prepared. Margaret read the first line. "Statement of conditional disclosure. If this safety deposit box is opened by Margaret Ellis, the following documents may be released and explained by legal counsel present." Margaret looked up, released. Mr. Hale nodded. "Yes, to who?" "To you, and eventually to authorities if necessary." Margaret's heart skipped. Authorities. The banker unlocked the box and slid it gently toward her. "Mrs. Ellis," Mr. Hale said quietly, "your daughter believed her husband was involved in something illegal." Margaret's voice trembled slightly. "What kind of illegal?" Mr. Hale met her eyes. "Large-scale financial fraud." Margaret slowly lifted the lid of the box. Inside were several neatly organized folders. Emily had always been methodical. Even as a child, her school papers were always perfectly arranged. Now the same precision stared back from inside the metal box. There were 4 labeled folders: bank accounts, property records, debt transfers, email correspondence. Margaret opened the first folder. Bank statements. Dozens of them. Multiple banks. Some she recognized, others she had never heard of. The balances made her inhale sharply. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moving between accounts, sometimes overnight, sometimes in strange repeating patterns. Margaret looked up. "I don't understand any of this." Mr. Hale nodded. "That's normal." He opened another folder. "Your daughter came to me 3 months ago." Margaret stared at him. She knew, yes, how. Mr. Hale flipped to a printed email. She discovered irregular financial activity connected to her husband. Margaret read the email. It was from Emily. Subject: "Something isn't right, Raymond. I need advice. I think Daniel is moving money through accounts that shouldn't exist. The debts keep appearing in our name, but the money disappears somewhere else. I don't know exactly what he's doing yet, but I know one thing. If something happens to me, I want the truth protected." Margaret's hands shook slightly. She thought something might happen to her. Mr. Hale answered carefully. She believed Daniel was hiding serious financial crimes. Margaret opened the second folder, property records, but not just for their house, other houses, small rental properties, 3 in neighboring counties, all connected through different companies with unfamiliar names. Mr. Hale explained quietly. These appear to be shell companies. What does that mean? It means they exist mostly on paper. Margaret frowned. Why would someone do that? To hide money. Margaret opened the third folder. Debt transfers. The documents were complicated. Legal agreements, loan contracts. Margaret skimmed through them. One sentence stood out repeatedly. Personal liability secured against shared marital assets. Margaret looked up slowly. Does this mean? Mr. Hale finished the thought. Yes, if Daniel's scheme collapsed, the debt could fall on your daughter. Margaret felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. Emily hadn't just been suspicious. She had been protecting herself and protecting Margaret. Margaret closed the folder slowly. Why didn't she go to the police? Mr. Hale leaned back. She was gathering evidence first. How long had she been doing that? About 4 months. Margaret's mind raced. 4 months, which meant Emily had started investigating shortly after the house ownership transfer. Emily had known exactly what she was doing. Margaret opened the final folder. Emails, printed messages, some between Daniel and unknown contacts, others between Daniel and financial institutions. One email was highlighted. Margaret read it slowly. Subject: timing. Once the Maple Ridge property is sold, the remaining balance can be cleared. After that, we move the rest through the Nevada account. No loose ends. Margaret's heart skipped. That's our house. Mr. Hale nodded. Yes. Margaret looked at him. You're saying Daniel planned to sell the house to cover his debts, yes? And the debts would have been tied to Emily. Mr. Hale nodded again. That appears to be the plan. Margaret closed the folder. Now everything made sense. Daniel's urgency, the 60 days, the rush to sell. He had needed the house money quickly, but Emily had quietly removed the one thing he needed most: ownership. Margaret sat silently for several seconds. Then she asked the question that had been forming in her mind since she entered the bank. What happens now? Mr. Hale answered calmly. That depends on you. Margaret looked at him. On me, yes. He tapped the folders gently. This evidence could start a financial investigation. Margaret swallowed. And Daniel? Mr. Hale didn't soften the answer. If these documents are confirmed, he could face criminal charges. Margaret closed the box slowly. For the first time since Emily's funeral, she felt something other than grief. Not anger, not revenge, something steadier. Just as Emily had trusted her with the truth, now Margaret understood why. And somewhere across town, Daniel Carter was still living inside a house he believed he could sell. Still believing his biggest problem was a paperwork mistake. He had no idea the truth was already sitting inside a bank vault waiting, because Daniel Carter wasn't the only one who would soon discover Emily's secret investigation. The moment the evidence left that bank, everything would begin to unravel. Daniel Carter was standing in the kitchen when the knock came. It was mid-morning, the kind of quiet weekday morning where the neighborhood felt almost empty. Daniel had spent the last few days making phone calls. Lawyers, real estate offices, even the county records department, all of them had given him the same answer. The house belonged to Margaret Ellis legally, completely, and until she signed something, he couldn't sell it. Daniel slammed a cabinet door. The whole situation was ridiculous. Margaret had barely spoken to him in years. There was no way she understood what she was doing. Eventually she would come back. Eventually she would agree to sell. She had to. Daniel poured himself coffee. Then the knock came again. 3 firm taps. Not the casual knock of a neighbor. Daniel walked to the front door. When he opened it, 2 men were standing on the porch, both wearing dark suits, both holding identification badges. The older one spoke first. Daniel Carter. Daniel frowned. Yes, the man held up his badge. We're with the Financial Crimes Investigation Unit. Daniel felt the world pause for half a second, but he forced a small smile. Can I help you? The second investigator spoke. We'd like to ask you a few questions regarding several financial transactions connected to your name. Daniel's chest tightened slightly. What kind of transactions? The older investigator replied calmly. Bank transfers involving several shell corporations. Daniel felt the word hit him like a brick. Shell corporations. The investigator continued. Do you mind if we come in? Daniel hesitated, but refusing would only make things worse. He stepped aside. Sure, the investigator sat at the dining table, the same table where Emily had asked about the accounts months earlier. Daniel stayed standing, trying to remain calm, trying not to show anything. The older investigator opened a folder. Inside were documents. Daniel recognized some of them immediately. Bank statements, loan agreements, corporate filings. The investigator slid one of the pages across the table. Do you recognize this company? Daniel glanced down. Redstone Holdings LLC. His throat tightened slightly. Yes, he said casually. It was part of a consulting project. The investigator nodded. And this one? Another page. Hawthorne Asset Group. Daniel forced a shrug. Investment partner. The investigator didn't react. Instead, he slid a third document forward. This account moved approximately $240,000 over the past year. Daniel crossed his arms. That's business. The investigator tapped the page. The account is linked to debt contracts under your wife's name. Daniel felt a cold sensation move down his spine. That must be a mistake. The second investigator spoke quietly. We don't believe it is. Daniel leaned back slightly. Why are you asking me about this? The older investigator answered, because someone submitted documentation suggesting these transactions may involve fraudulent liability transfers. Daniel's heart skipped. Someone submitted documentation. Who? His mind raced. Then the answer came instantly. Margaret. Daniel clenched his jaw. This sounds like a misunderstanding. The investigator looked at him steadily. Your wife appears to have been investigating these transactions before her death. Daniel's stomach tightened. Investigating? Yes. The investigator opened another document. Printed emails. Highlighted sections. Daniel recognized the messages immediately. They were private, old correspondence between him and the financial contacts he worked with. How did they get these? The investigator spoke again. These emails suggest the Maple Ridge property was intended to cover a large portion of the debt. Daniel felt his pulse rising. That's not illegal, no, the investigator agreed, but moving debt liability onto another person without disclosure can be. The room went quiet. Daniel stared at the documents. Every piece of evidence looked familiar, but the context had changed. Now they looked like something else. Something dangerous. The second investigator closed the folder. Mr. Carter, we're not placing you under arrest today. Daniel exhaled slightly. But we are opening a formal investigation. Daniel forced a nod. Okay. The investigator stood. In the meantime, we ask that you do not attempt to transfer or sell any properties connected to these accounts. Daniel laughed slightly. I can't sell the house anyway. The investigator tilted his head. Why not? Daniel hesitated. Then he muttered, my mother-in-law owns it. Both investigators exchanged a brief glance. The older one said calmly, yes, we're aware. Daniel froze. You're aware? The investigator nodded. She provided the documentation. Daniel felt the room spin slightly. Margaret, she had done this quietly without warning. The investigator gathered the documents. Mr. Carter will be in touch. They walked toward the door. Before leaving, the older investigator turned back. One more thing. Daniel looked up. Your wife appears to have been documenting this activity for several months. Daniel said nothing. The investigator added quietly. She was very thorough. After the door closed, Daniel stood in the silent house, his mind racing. Emily had known all those questions, all those late nights on her laptop. She hadn't just suspected something, she had been building a case. And Margaret now held everything. The house, the evidence, the control. Daniel walked slowly into the living room. The house suddenly felt different. Not like an asset anymore. More like a trap. And for the first time since the funeral, Daniel Carter realized something terrifying. Emily hadn't left him unprotected. She had left him exposed. Because Daniel Carter still had one more confrontation waiting for him. One he could not avoid. The moment when the woman he had thrown out of the house would return and show him exactly what his late wife had left behind. 3 days after the investigators visited the house, Daniel Carter heard another knock on the front door. But this time, he knew exactly who it was. He had spent the last 72 hours making desperate phone calls. Lawyers, former business partners, even the contacts connected to the shell companies. Every conversation ended the same way. People distancing themselves. Accounts suddenly closing. Numbers no longer working. The investigation had already begun spreading, and everyone involved was starting to disappear. Daniel walked slowly toward the front door when he opened it. Margaret Ellis was standing on the porch. She looked calm. Not angry, not triumphant, just steady. Behind her stood a man Daniel had never seen before. Older gray suit, leather briefcase. Margaret spoke first. Hello, Daniel. Daniel swallowed. You came back. Margaret nodded. Yes, for a moment neither of them moved. Then Margaret said quietly, may we come in? Daniel stepped aside. The living room looked exactly the same as the night Margaret left. The same couch, the same photos, the same silence. Margaret walked slowly into the room. Her eyes briefly rested on the staircase. But she didn't linger there. Instead, she turned to Daniel. This is Mr. Raymond Hale. Daniel's stomach tightened slightly. The lawyer, Mr. Hale, nodded politely. Yes. Margaret sat down at the dining table, the same place where Daniel had told her she had 60 days to leave. Daniel remained standing. What do you want? Margaret placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of the documents from the bank, Emily's investigation, the financial records, the emails. Daniel recognized them immediately. His face hardened. You gave those to the investigators. Margaret didn't deny it. Yes. Daniel laughed bitterly. You're trying to destroy me. Margaret looked at him carefully. No. Her voice stayed calm. You did that yourself. Daniel paced once across the room. You don't understand business. Margaret didn't react. You were moving debt into Emily's name. Daniel stopped walking. That's not illegal. Mr. Hale finally spoke. It can be, if it was done without full disclosure. Daniel glared at him. You're not part of this family. Mr. Hale closed the folder. No, but your wife asked me to protect her interests. Daniel looked back at Margaret. Emily wouldn't do this to me. Margaret's eyes softened slightly. She didn't do it to you. She tapped the folder. She did it to protect herself. Daniel felt the words hit deeper than he expected. Margaret continued quietly. She knew what you were doing. Daniel's voice dropped. She misunderstood. Margaret shook her head slowly. No, she understood very clearly. The room went quiet. Margaret reached into her bag. Then she placed one final item on the table. Emily's letter. Daniel stared at the handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. He read it silently. When he finished, he didn't look up immediately. Margaret spoke softly. She loved you. Daniel closed his eyes. But she was afraid of what you were becoming. Daniel sat down heavily in the chair. For the first time since Margaret arrived, his anger faded. Only exhaustion remained. You could have just sold the house, he muttered. Margaret shook her head. No. Daniel looked up. Why not? Margaret answered with quiet certainty. Because Emily didn't leave me that house to make money. She looked around the living room, the photos, the walls, the memories. She left it so this would always remain her home. Daniel said nothing. Margaret stood slowly. Mr. Hale gathered the documents. Margaret walked toward the door. Before leaving, she paused. Then she said the final thing Daniel Carter would hear from her. You gave me 60 days to leave. Daniel stared at the floor. Margaret continued quietly. But you forgot something. Daniel looked up. This house, she glanced once more around the room, was never yours to give away. 6 months later, the Maple Ridge house still stood exactly where it always had. But the story of Daniel Carter had spread through Cedar Ridge. The investigation confirmed what Emily had discovered. Financial fraud, hidden accounts, liability transfers. Daniel Carter eventually accepted a plea agreement tied to the financial crimes uncovered during the investigation. But Margaret Ellis never attended the hearings. She didn't need to. For her, the story had already ended. Not in a courtroom, but in the quiet living room where Emily had grown up. Margaret returned to the house that winter. She repaired the porch Emily had painted. She planted flowers in the garden, and on Sunday evenings, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, sometimes remembering the girl who used to run down those stairs 2 at a time. Life had changed, but Emily's home remained exactly what it had always been, a place where truth had quietly won. And sometimes the people who believe they hold all the power forget something important. The quiet person in the room may already know the truth, and when the truth finally appears, it doesn't shout. It simply stands there, unmovable, just like the home Emily Ellis protected until the very end. Before you go, if this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt familiar, or made you angry, or made you think about someone you know, then you already understand why these stories are told. Because sometimes injustice doesn't happen in public. Sometimes it happens quietly. Inside homes, inside families, inside decisions people think no one will ever question. But the truth has a strange way of surfacing. And when it does, it reminds us that character is revealed not when things are easy but when power is tested. If you made it this far in the story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing to the Untold Story Files, where we continue uncovering the moments that were almost forgotten. Because the next story may reveal a truth no one expected.